Close the door, kill the lights, and come closer. The air in my recording studio tonight is cold, even though the window is sealed. I can smell ozone, that sharp, electric tang that sometimes clings to the edge of a fading signal. The smell of something that was never meant to be recorded, picked up only by chance in the vast, echoing static of the midnight void. It's the sound of the deep, old silence of the mountains finally speaking. And trust me, you do not want to miss a word. Tonight, we're heading deep into the Sentinel Valley of Montana, a place where the landscape remembers things its inhabitants have chosen to forget. Before we even start this drive down the endless highway, check the lock on your window just in case. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me, where are you listening from right now, and what time is it officially too late for you to be awake? 9 minutes past midnight here. Now, dim the lights, let the silence settle in, and let's step into the dark together. I remember the exact moment the universe stopped making sense, and it wasn't when I saw a ghost or a creature. It was inside a police cruiser on a Friday morning, staring at a piece of faded, photocopied paper taped crudely inside the passenger visor. 6 years. 6 years I'd served the Sentinel Valley Patrol, the jurisdiction covering a massive, isolated stretch of the Blackfeet Reservation right up against the Rocky Mountain front. I was Elias Redcrow, a decent cop, solid on protocol, respected the traditional laws, understood the local history. But I was also modern, skeptical, educated. I dealt with drunk driving, domestic disputes, missing livestock, and the occasional drug bust. That was the first law, the law with badges, reports, and evidence. Then there was the second law. My partner, Naomi Birdstone, a veteran of 12 years whose face held the weariness of the mountains themselves, was the first to point it out to me. When I was fresh out of training, she laughed, but with an unsettling edge, and handed me the edicts of the deep. They weren't laminated or official. They looked like instructions for fixing a faulty coffee maker, photocopied so many times the text was blurry. They were taped everywhere, inside the breaker box, on the back of the station's bulletin board, tacked up in the communal shower room. They weren't rules of conduct. They were rules of survival. Rule 1. Never patrol alone after the moon sets, regardless of shift. Rule 4. Do not use the word ancient or before when speaking within sight of the peak. Rule 7. If you find an animal perfectly posed and undamaged, do not touch it. Report it as lost to the mountain and leave it. I thought it was morbid, localized dark humor, a way the old-timers messed with the newbies. My boss, Captain Running Elk, was always tight-lipped about them, just saying, "They've been here longer than us, Elias. They just are." I usually filed them mentally under local superstition and promptly ignored them. Until the call came in about Megan Cole. Megan Cole was a tourist, a hiker from California, foolishly trying to find herself deep in the front without a guide. She was overdue by 48 hours. When we found her SUV parked neatly at the trailhead, the scent of pine and damp earth was overwhelming. We found her 3 miles deep, just off the old Glacier Creek path. She hadn't fallen. She hadn't been attacked by wildlife. She was sitting upright, leaning against a moss-covered boulder, her hands clawing futilely at the throat of her hiking jacket. Her backpack lay next to her, untouched. But her face. It's one thing to see death. I've seen plenty, but it's another thing to see horror. Megan Cole's face was an exercise in pure, visceral dread. Her eyes were wide, white-rimmed, dried tears marking tracks through the dust on her cheeks. Her jaw was slack, the corners of her mouth pulled back in a silent, agonizing scream that the earth seemed to have swallowed whole. Her expression wasn't one of pain. It was the reflection of something utterly incomprehensible, something that ripped the logic center right out of her brain. Forensics, when they finally arrived, slowly, because this was Sentinel Valley, and they had to drive 3 hours, found nothing. No struggle, no trauma, no signs of poisoning. The cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest, sudden onset. The official story was a heart anomaly exacerbated by altitude and stress. But that expression wasn't stress. That expression was the last thing she saw telling her, definitively, that reality was broken. She saw something, Elias, Naomi muttered, staring at the blurred photos back at the station. She didn't mean a bear or a coyote. She looked at the image, then glanced guiltily toward the cracked window, as if the mountain peak itself might be listening. I found myself walking over to the station copier. I pulled down the old edicts taped to the back of the clock, the ones that read, Rule 9. If a stranger dies, their fear is not yours. Do not stare too long into the void they left behind. It's just panic, Naomi. Hypothermia does funny things to the central nervous system. I argued, the words sounding weak even to me. Grounding fact, studies in psychology show that extreme, sudden emotional shock, like witnessing a catastrophic event or deep personal terror, can trigger massive spikes in catecholamines, adrenaline/noradrenaline, potentially leading to stress-induced cardiomyopathy, commonly known as broken heart syndrome, which mimics heart attack symptoms but leaves little physical trace of traditional trauma. Reflective thought. Fear isn't about what we see. It's about what we imagine is watching us, lurking just outside the periphery of the verifiable world. Megan Cole didn't die of a heart attack. She died because her imagination finally met its limit. The mystery of Megan Cole was officially closed by the federal agent Harlan, who was flown in briefly and seemed annoyed by the local lack of cooperation and enthusiasm for mundane paperwork. Harlan wanted a clean, physical answer. We had only the smell of panic and the silence of the massive, indifferent mountains. But the silence didn't last long. That same week, Leonard Spotted Eagle, who ran a large cattle ranch bordering the deep foothills, reported his losses. And that, more than any human death, truly introduced me to the concept of the hollow walkers. Speculative concept. I kept thinking about the edicts. What if they weren't jokes? What if they were the fragile, 1,000-year-old stipulations of a contract? A contract written not between men, but between the living and something ancient, something that resented the existence of the visible world, what the old stories called those who were before, or more chillingly, the absence. We were breaking the rules, and the mountain was starting to collect its tribute. The dread started to sink in, heavy and viscous, like mountain silt. I remembered Rule 7 of the edicts. If you find an animal perfectly posed and undamaged, do not touch it. And I realized the cattle incident wasn't going to be about bullets or predators. It was going to be about architecture. The unsettling, precise architecture of terror. The incident at Leonard Spotted Eagle's ranch didn't make the national news, but it shattered the fragile sense of order in Sentinel Valley far more effectively than any human casualty. Megan Cole's death was tragic, but explainable, even if the explanation was inadequate. What happened to Leonard's herd was a declaration. 15 head of Angus cattle were found scattered across a small, frost-covered meadow near the tree line. When Naomi and I arrived, the silence was intense, a pressurized silence that didn't feel empty, but rather full of listening things. The animals were untouched. There wasn't a drop of blood, no sign of struggle, no claw marks, no predator teeth. Their hides were perfectly intact, but they were posed. I mean that literally. Each cow was frozen in a grotesque parody of movement. One massive bull was stiffened mid-gait, one foreleg lifted impossibly high, head craned back, muzzle wide open, emitting a silent, permanent bellow. Another was contorted, spine snapped, not broken, but locked into an agonizing spiral that defied bovine anatomy. Their bodies had achieved a rigor mortis so immediate and absolute that they felt like sculptures carved from obsidian. Leonard's spotted eagle stood at the fence line, holding a rifle he clearly knew was useless. His face was gray. "They weren't killed, Elias," he whispered, spitting the words out like grit. "They were scared to death. They died running from something that wasn't there." The smell was cold, cold and metallic, but not of blood. It was the smell of fear rendered physical. We spent hours there, measuring, photographing, documenting the impossible. The stiffness was extreme. I tried to move one of the cow's legs. It resisted like iron. It wasn't just rigor. It was the way their internal structure had solidified under immense, unseen pressure. Grounding fact: normal rigor mortis, the stiffening of muscles post-mortem due to chemical changes, is a gradual process, usually peaking 12 to 24 hours after death and resolving 48 to 72 hours later. The state of Leonard's cattle defied this biological timeline completely. They were instantly ossified, every muscle fiber locked in a memory of profound terror. This instantaneous, unnatural setting suggested not biology, but something thermodynamic, a massive, sudden energy drain that froze motion itself. Naomi wouldn't go near them. She stayed near the cruiser, smoking furiously, reciting Rule 7 under her breath. Do not touch it. Report it as lost to the mountain and leave it. The mountain is hungry again, Elias, she finally said, her voice dry. And it's reminding us that the fence works both ways. We forget the rules, and the payment goes up. I was still fighting it, clinging to forensic explanations. Maybe a rare neurotoxin? A localized seismic event that caused pure panic? But even as I searched for hoof prints or scuff marks, the reality was too elegant, too silent for any natural phenomenon. It felt like vandalism executed by a conceptual artist, a gallery of agonizing statues left purely for us to find. The federal agent, Harlan, returned briefly. He took one look at the photos. Leonard insisted we burn the bodies, refusing to let Harlan take samples, and filed a report listing unknown environmental factors leading to mass hysteria and subsequent rapid internal organ failure. Harlan was a man of the outside world. He had no category for perfect, silent terror. The second law was ceasing to be folklore. It was becoming procedure. If the cattle were a declaration, the disappearance of the three hikers, James, Sarah, and David, was a vacuum. They were experienced climbers, attempting a traverse of the high, remote passes known only to local hunters and the oldest maps. They checked in Friday night from their base camp. By Saturday noon, The emergency signal on their satellite phone went dark. When Naomi and I reached the base camp, it was undisturbed. Their tent was pitched, supplies neatly stacked, and a portable stove was still warm. But they were gone. Completely. There was no struggle, no blood, no gear abandoned on the ground. It was as if they had simply stepped out of the tent and off the edge of the world. We spent 5 days coordinating the search. Local volunteers, reservation patrol, and finally, search and rescue teams from Helena and Missoula. We scoured every crevice, every ridge line, every choke point in a 10-mile radius. The hardest part was the silence. When people are lost in the mountains, they leave signs: a dropped water bottle, a broken branch, a misplaced footprint. The landscape swallows them slowly, leaving crumbs. These 3 were swallowed instantly. The mountain was perfectly clean. It offered no resistance, no clues, no echo. It's a peculiar kind of horror when absence is the only evidence. When something is violently destroyed, you know the nature of the fight. When something simply ceases to be, you realize you are dealing with a force that doesn't obey conservation laws. I remembered the old Blackfeet stories that Isaac Heavy Runner, the elder who still lived remotely up the Two Medicine Valley, used to tell me when I was a boy. He spoke of the absence, not spirits, but holes in reality, places where the boundaries between here and the before were thin, places where the entities could simply reach out, take what they wanted, and erase the memory of the taking. Speculative concept. What if those who were before weren't feeding on flesh, but on potential energy? What if the goal wasn't to kill, but to unmake? The cattle died of pure terror, freezing their biological potential. The hikers were removed entirely, their memories and potential futures absorbed into the mountain's vast geological silence. Maybe the contract the second law enforced wasn't about appeasement, but about structured sacrifice, keeping the appetite of the mountain predictable. I drove back to the station on the 5th evening, the exhaustion crushing. I looked at Naomi, slumped in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead. Her usual cynical fire was extinguished, replaced by a deep, aqueous dread. I need to talk to Isaac, I told her. I need to know the real rules, not the blurred photocopies. Naomi nodded slowly. You think Isaac knows how to stop it? I think he knows how to live with it. Which is the same thing, up here. The dread was visceral now. It wasn't the distant fear of the unknown. It was the chilling realization that my close-knit, pragmatic world was nested inside a far older, merciless ecosystem. We weren't the top of the food chain here. We were tolerated, provided we remembered to pay the ancient toll. But the real shock, the moment that stopped my breath and drove me definitively over the edge of skepticism, wasn't the cattle, or the missing hikers, or the face of Megan Cole. It was personal. It involved the one person I had trusted in that desolate landscape. Reflective thought. We spend our lives building walls of logic and reason to keep the world manageable. But when the walls come down, the horror isn't the chaotic freedom of the outside. It's the suffocating revelation that the outside has always been organized, intelligent, and deeply, terribly indifferent to our small laws and our smaller fears. The radio crackled suddenly, interrupting the absolute vacuum of my thoughts. Captain Running Elk's voice, tight, strained, demanding immediate backup. Something had happened at Naomi's house, just outside the settlement perimeter. Something swift, silent, and final. My foot slammed on the gas pedal. I knew, with the horrible certainty that only true panic can bring what the mountain had finally decided to take. It had taken my partner, Naomi Birdstone. The dread had been a creeping fog. Naomi's disappearance was a lightning strike. When I reached her small, isolated house, a place she had always claimed was safe because it was built on a patch of earth too stubborn to surrender, the scene was minimalist horror. Captain Running Elk was standing on the porch, his shoulders slumped, looking 20 years older than he was. The front door was ajar, but not forced. The lock was intact. The alarm system, Naomi's pride, showed no activation record. Inside, everything was normal, yet wrong. A half-eaten bowl of soup sat on the kitchen table. A magazine lay open beside an armchair. The television was paused, the screen displaying a talking head mid-sentence. Naomi hadn't been home long. She'd clearly just started winding down after our shift. But she wasn't there. There was no blood, no shattered furniture, no sign of a struggle. Just like the hikers, she hadn't been violently removed. She had been delicately, surgically excised from her life. Except for one detail. In the center of the living room rug, neatly aligned, were 3 long, segmented tracks, not footprints, but shallow, parallel depressions in the thick pile of the rug, each track about 3 feet long, tapering at the end. They looked less like something was dragged and more like something pressed itself into the fibers, moving with enormous, silent weight. Tommy White Calf was first on scene. Running Elk whispered, his eyes on the tracks. Tommy, the newest, most skeptical cop, was vomiting quietly outside in the snow. He said they smelled like rain and ozone, Elias. Like a radio tower in a thunderstorm. I crouched down, running my hand near the tracks, not daring to touch them. They felt cold, strangely draining. This was the entity, or entities, the hollow walkers that had terrified Megan Cole, absorbed the potential of the cattle, and erased the 3 hikers. They were tall, silent, and possessed a mobility that defied physics, described in the ancient stories as moving like shadows cast by a light that isn't there. They took Naomi because she was close to me, because we were getting too curious, too invested in the second law. They took her as leverage, as a cruel, specific form of communication. I didn't file a report. I didn't call Agent Harlan. I looked at Captain Running Elk. He understood. This was beyond the first law. Isaac Heavy Runner. I stated, my voice rough. Where is he now? Isaac, the last keeper of the truly ancient knowledge, lived far up the front, in a small cabin accessible only by a difficult trail, maintaining a self-imposed isolation. He was old, maybe 90, his mind sharp as glacial ice, his eyes holding the immense silence of the mountains. I drove out immediately, leaving Tommy to guard the crime scene, which held no crime, only absence. The drive was desperate, fueled by adrenaline and a terrifying urgency. Naomi wasn't simply missing. She was taken by something that played with time and fear, and every minute she spent with them was a minute of her sanity being drained away. When I finally hiked into Isaac's clearing, the elder was sitting outside, watching the jagged line of the Rocky Mountain front against the bruised evening sky. He didn't seem surprised to see me. He had been expecting me. She is not dead, Elias, Isaac said immediately, without preamble, as if continuing a conversation we started years ago. But she is held. They require something. He invited me inside his cabin, which smelled strongly of cedar and decades of smoke. The walls were lined not with books, but with leather scrolls and meticulously drawn maps of constellations and earth energy lines. Isaac explained the truth of the Sentinel Valley, the truth buried beneath the reservation's modern structures and forgotten by most of my people. The Blackfeet, he explained, arrived millennia ago, but the mountains were not empty. They belonged to those who were before, powerful elemental entities that predated human consciousness, beings of cold air, static electricity, and geological memory. Grounding fact: in many indigenous spiritual traditions, landscapes, especially mountains, are not inert backdrops but active entities, capable of consciousness, judgment, and communication. The concept of genius loci, spirit of the place, dictates that human activity must be carefully negotiated with the original, powerful inhabitants of the land to avoid supernatural or ecological retribution. We fought them once, Isaac explained, his voice rattling like dry corn husks. We couldn't win. They are not evil, Elias. They are just the rules of the deep earth. They demand respect, and they demand their due. So we negotiated. The second law, those photocopied edicts, were the modern remnants of the Great Boundary Contract. For us to live here, relatively safe, we had to agree to maintain the boundary, a powerful, complex ritual that anchored reality and prevented the full, chaotic incursion of the before ones. The boundary was physical, spiritual, and observational. It required regular maintenance, specific prayers, and a willingness to offer back small, controlled sacrifices, usually things of memory or attention. When the community forgets, when the rituals lapse, the entities take bigger tolls. The terror of a tourist, the vital force of cattle, the potential of hikers. And now, they took Naomi, a clear demand to reinstate the contract. Isaac confessed that he was the last boundary keeper. The responsibility had passed down through his family, but the modern world had scoffed the power away. He was dying. He wouldn't last another winter. And if the keeper died without passing the flame, the boundary would collapse, and the Sentinel Valley would become a hunting ground. Speculative concept. Isaac showed me the map of the ritual site, a high plateau known as the Stone Crown, visible from almost anywhere in the valley, a geological node where the veil was thinnest. The ritual, he explained, was an exchange, a binding promise of service in return for the safe release of Naomi and the continuation of the contract. The mountain wasn't interested in killing me. It was interested in recruiting me, ensuring the boundary was maintained for the next generation. It wanted a replacement for Isaac. The great ritual was massive, intricate, requiring precise timing, offerings of deep personal significance, and a vow that meant forfeiting my own future freedom, a vow to be the keeper until my own death. Isaac was too weak to perform it. It was now my decision. Naomi's life and the safety of the entire community rested on me, the skeptical cop who had scoffed at the laminated rules. They have what they want, Isaac said, placing a cold, heavy stone talisman into my hand. It was dull obsidian, ancient and chillingly smooth. A new keeper. They will release her, but only after you have performed the ritual, and only if they are satisfied with your intention. I looked at the talisman, then back toward the valley, the silence of the mountains overwhelming the practical noise of the world I knew. I had been a police officer for 6 years, dedicated to upholding the first law. Now, I was being forced to serve a terrifying, cosmic second law, one based not on evidence, but on eternal dread. Reflective thought. Power is not always strength. Sometimes, power is just knowing where the line is drawn and accepting that you are the only one standing on it. I hadn't wanted this burden, but watching Naomi's life disappear into the mountain shadow, I knew I had no choice but to step forward and meet the things that defied my world. That night, under a sky choked with remote, cold stars, I began the impossible trek up to the stone crown, clutching Isaac's obsidian relic, rehearsing the ancient, binding words of the ritual, a contract with the before ones, trading my life for Naomi's, and securing the fragile piece of the valley for another generation. The mountain was waiting for its new servant. The ascent to the stone crown was not physically difficult, but spiritually annihilating. Isaac had stressed that the ritual site, a plateau nestled high above the timberline, existed not just in space, but slightly out of time. As I climbed, the air grew thinner, colder, and the silence intensified until it became a physical pressure on my eardrums. I moved with a terrible, focused clarity. The fear had curdled into responsibility. I wasn't Elias Redcrow, the cop anymore. I was a man carrying a 1,000-year burden, hiking up to meet the original landlords of the earth. I carried the necessary offerings: water from a specific spring, certain types of mountain sage, and the obsidian talisman. But Isaac was clear. The primary offering was the vow itself, the unconditional, lifelong promise to maintain the boundary. When I reached the stone crown, the world tilted. The plateau wasn't naturally formed. It was a massive, flat surface of black, porous rock, perfectly circular, about 60 feet across. In the center, a single, naturally shaped altar stone, slicked with a thin film of ice despite the windless air. The sky was absolute black velvet, the stars unnervingly close, looking less like distant suns and more like cold pinpricks in a vast, breathing membrane. I began the ritual, following the complex sequence of gestures and chants Isaac had drilled into me. The language was Old Blackfeet, words that tasted like dust and ozone on my tongue. I moved around the perimeter, drawing boundaries with the sage, establishing a zone of mutual recognition. And then they arrived. I hadn't heard a sound, felt a tremor, or seen a shadow shift. They were simply there. They emerged from the air itself, coalescing against the backdrop of the stars. I counted 3 of them, standing just beyond the perimeter line I had drawn. The descriptions in the old stories were right. They were tall, easily 8 feet, and unnervingly thin, their limbs seeming too long, bending in ways that suggested bones weren't strictly necessary. They didn't have definable faces, only smooth, dark surfaces that absorbed the light. But the most unsettling thing was the sense of profound, focused attention they directed toward me. They weren't moving, they were adjusting. Their bodies vibrated subtly, emitting that sharp, electric tang I associated with dead frequencies and Naomi's rug. They weren't creatures of flesh and blood. They were constructs of cold logic and immense, hungry silence. The absence made manifest. I forced myself to look at them, reciting the ancient introduction, a formal recognition of their primordial sovereignty over the land. My voice was surprisingly steady, probably because the fear was so overwhelming it had looped back around to awe. Grounding fact: Anthropological studies of human entity contact narratives often highlight the concept of the uncanny valley, where beings that are almost human but fundamentally wrong cause maximum psychological distress. These entities were the apex of the uncanny, intelligences that interacted with the world using a different physics, terrifying precisely because they demanded immediate recalibration of all observed reality. The ritual required an offering. I placed the water and sage on the altar stone. But the most important element was the exchange. You took Naomi Birdstone. I chanted, the words echoing weakly against the immense bulk of the mountains. She is the price of our negligence. But the boundary must hold. I offer myself in perpetuity as the keeper, a bridge, a mediator, an observer. There was no voice in return, no thunderous pronouncement. But the air around the entity closest to me seemed to thicken, drawing the light inwards. I felt a probe, not a touch, but a scrutiny, reaching into the deepest, quietest parts of my mind. They weren't interested in my surface thoughts. They wanted my sincerity, my commitment to the cosmic debt. This was the terrifying heart of the ritual, entering into a contract with a force that viewed human years as negligible and human emotion as energy to be consumed. Speculative concept. Isaac had warned me about the nature of the entity's hunger. They didn't feed on life, but on attention. By enforcing the ritual, I was giving them what they demanded, a structured form of awareness, a fixed point of human vigilance toward their existence. The boundary was maintained by this constant, formalized mental effort. If I failed, their hunger would become unmanaged, leading to the chaotic, untargeted drain that had killed Megan Cole. I knelt, placing my hand flat on the obsidian altar stone. The stone was impossibly cold, drawing the warmth directly from my bones. I delivered the final, binding oath, swearing on my lineage, my memory, and the land itself, that I would be the keeper until the day I died, ensuring the lineage of protection was maintained. As the final syllable left my lips, the world fractured. I felt a tremendous, agonizing pressure, not pain, but the sensation of my entire inner life being mapped, cataloged, and signed over. My skepticism, my memories of the first law, my connections to the modern world, all were sifted through, evaluated, and accepted as collateral. Then, just as silently as they appeared, they vanished. The pressure lifted. The stone crown was cold, empty, and silent once more. I stayed there for an hour, shaking, unable to move. The contract was sealed. I was no longer just Elias Redcrow. I was the boundary keeper, the keeper of the terrifying second law. I descended the mountain just before dawn. As I reached the tree line, my radio crackled, the first time it had worked since I left the cruiser. Captain Running Elk's voice was strained, relief warring with shock. Elias? She's back. Naomi is back. Naomi Birdstone was found on the edge of the reservation, sitting by the highway, shivering uncontrollably. They took her to the small clinic. She was physically fine, unharmed, but terrifyingly distant. I went to see her immediately. When she saw me, her eyes, those eyes that had always held the hard wisdom of the valley, flickered, devoid of recognition, but full of something vast and empty. Naomi, I said softly, approaching her bed. She didn't look at me. She stared fixedly at the ceiling, her lips moving silently. Then she spoke, her voice high and thin, the sound of glass breaking. It is dark up there, Elias. The rocks breathe. They breathe and they watch. They taught me how to forget everything, just in case. Reflective thought. The before ones had kept their end of the bargain. They released her, but they didn't release her undamaged. They hadn't consumed her body. They had consumed her peace, her internal architecture, leaving her a traumatized shell. I saved her life, but they had changed her definition of reality forever. This was the cost of the contract. I knew then that my vow was the right choice. Naomi was the first, and I vowed she would be the last person to pay such a steep, personal toll for the valley's collective forgetfulness. I had traded my skepticism for faith, my freedom for an eternal, terrible servitude. I was the boundary keeper now, and the night was just beginning. 6 months had passed since I returned from the Stone Crown. 6 months defined by a chilling duality. By day, I was Officer Elias Redcrow, navigating the mundane reality of the first law, traffic citations, paperwork, and the quiet despair of a community struggling against economic hardship. By night, I was the keeper, studying the dense, cryptic teachings Isaac had entrusted to me before his inevitable passing a few weeks after the ritual. Isaac died peacefully, satisfied that the boundary was secured for the time being. But his death left me utterly alone, the final, tenuous link to the world of those who were before. Captain Running Elk knew. He didn't ask questions. He just ensured my schedule was flexible enough for my monthly ritual duties. The immediate, escalating terror that had struck Sentinel Valley vanished. The incidents decreased sharply. No more terrified tourists. No more herds turned into statues. The entities were appeased. They had their keeper, and the ritual was being maintained. But the incidents did not stop completely. The mountain still occasionally claimed its price, but now the toll was smaller, more precise, often ambiguous enough to be dismissed by outside authorities. Missing pets, strange whispers caught on radio frequencies near the high passes, localized power outages that defied explanation. They were reminders, subtle nudges that the entities were present, watching, and expecting the contract to be honored. Naomi, that was the hardest part of my new life. She had returned, but she never truly came back. She was permanently changed. She was medically stable, physically healthy, but she carried the deep psychic scarring of her time in the absence. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her words were tangential, focused on irrelevant details, or steeped in a paralyzing, inchoate dread. She was medically retired, living with her family, a silent, empty monument to the horror of forgetting. Grounding fact: studies of post-traumatic stress often cite dissociative amnesia or depersonalization as extreme coping mechanisms where the mind deliberately walls off horrific memories or detaches the individual from their own sense of reality. Naomi's condition was textbook dissociation, but caused not by human violence, but by an inhuman exposure to pure, unfiltered cosmic vacuum. I was performing the rituals diligently. Every new moon, I ascended to a specific, lower observation point, offering structured attention and conducting the smaller, monthly maintenance rites. It was draining. The attention the entities demanded was not just physical presence. It was mental energy, an acute focus on the boundary, leaving me perpetually exhausted, feeling less substantial than I used to. I began to understand the true nature of my servitude. I was a lightning rod, drawing the focus of the before ones toward myself, away from the vulnerable community. The worst part of this solitary burden was the fear of the future. The boundary required a continuous lineage of keepers. I was in my early 30s. I had decades of service ahead, but what happened after? Isaac had nearly failed, and the results were catastrophic. Speculative concept. I started carrying the heavy obsidian talisman everywhere. It wasn't just a physical reminder. It seemed to resonate with the boundary's energy. I realized that the entities hadn't just secured my service. They had subtly altered me, giving me a sensitivity to the thinning of the veil. I could feel the presence of the hollow walkers now, a dull, high-pitched static in my inner ear when they were near, a slight pressure drop in the atmosphere. This sensitivity was the tool of my trade, but it was also a curse, ensuring I could never truly rest or forget. My life became a frantic, desperate search for a successor. Someone from the tribe, someone with local roots, someone intelligent, pragmatic, yet open enough to accept the terrible, intangible truth. I couldn't risk leaving the boundary unguarded. The thought of the entities flooding the valley, collecting their full, unmanaged toll, paralyzed me. I tried Tommy White Calf, the new, skeptical cop, hinting at the old ways, the importance of the mountain. He just laughed nervously, talking about funding for better surveillance cameras. I spoke to local teachers, historians, even my own cousins. They were polite, nodded along, and then asked me to pass the salt. The skepticism was too deep, the modern insulation too effective. The community had simply forgotten the price of their safety. Reflective thought. Isolation is the ultimate weapon of the abyss. The less people believe in the dark, the more dangerous it becomes, because the burden of holding back the night falls entirely onto the few who still remember its shape. My strength wasn't just physical. It was the psychological fortitude to carry a secret that, if revealed, would label me a lunatic, and if broken, would kill everyone I knew. The quiet, almost peaceful routine of the last 6 months suddenly broke one rainy afternoon, right when I was starting to believe I had truly managed the chaos. I was driving patrol on the long, lonely stretch of Highway 2, the road that skirts the reservation border and leads back to the outside world. It was late afternoon, the rain turning the highway into a slick, reflective surface. A figure stood on the shoulder. It was a young woman, maybe 20 years old, dressed in clothes that were filthy and torn, yet somehow too light for the weather. She was soaked through, staring blankly at the asphalt. I pulled over, my stomach sinking into ice water. My internal static receiver, the subtle hum in my ear, was spiking violently. This wasn't a stranded traveler. I recognized her instantly from the missing persons files, though she had been gone so long I barely looked at the photos anymore. Sarah Chun, one of the 3 hikers who had vanished completely 6 months prior. The ones the mountain had supposedly unmade. I approached her cautiously. She didn't react to my presence, only stared forward. "Sarah, are you okay?" "I'm Officer Redcrow." She slowly turned her head. Her eyes were wide, clear, and terrifyingly vacant, worse than Naomi's. Naomi had dread. Sarah had nothing. She was a beautifully wrapped package with no contents. I was walking," she whispered, her voice reedy and thin, the sound of wind over stone. "Where did you come from, Sarah?" I asked, gripping the obsidian talisman in my pocket. She pointed vaguely toward the mountains, the high, silent peaks of the front. They let me go? I think. They said they were finished looking at my dreams. She had no memory of the past 6 months, no recollection of James or David, no sense of how she survived, or even who she was before she walked onto that highway. She was a blank slate, an empty vessel returned by a force that had no further use for her. The mountain hadn't merely erased her potential. It had studied her, used her, and returned the shell to send a message. We are still here. We are still watching. And we can change our minds at any time. I radioed Captain Running Elk, fighting the urge to look back at the jagged peak of the stone crown. Sarah Chun was the ominous open end of the contract, the clear, terrifying sign that the price of peace was subject to renegotiation, and that the entities were not bound by human concepts of finality. I had saved the community, but the contract was fluid, and I was the only one holding the line. And now, I had proof that the mountain kept trophies, returning them only when their purpose was served, their memory stripped bare. Sarah Chin's reappearance initiated a quiet crisis that only I, Running Elk, and a select few medical professionals understood. The outside world saw a miracle. A missing hiker returned alive. Federal Agent Harlan flew in, demanding interviews, forensic analysis, and a coherent timeline. We gave him none of it. Sarah simply couldn't provide anything coherent. She was a biological entity running on autopilot. Her dreams, she kept repeating, were gone. The mountain had apparently found them palatable. I spent time with her at the clinic, observing the subtle horror of her vacancy. She wasn't traumatized. She was fundamentally reorganized. She didn't flinch at loud noises, didn't react to familiar stimuli, but she constantly stared at the shadows, as if waiting for the other 3 feet of whatever had left the impressions on Naomi's carpet to appear. Her return was a cold-blooded demonstration of power by those who were before. They were reminding the keeper that their reach was absolute, that they could take or return anything at will, and that the boundary was merely a leash, not a cage. My isolation intensified. I had to manage the ritual, protect the community, and now, handle the evidence of Sarah Chun without breaking the contract's fundamental rule: never draw undue attention to the boundary. The monthly ritual had become a deeply personal, terrifying necessity. I no longer dreaded the entities. I acknowledged them. The relationship was transactional, defined by my continuous vigilance. The static in my ear was constant now, a low-frequency hum that reminded me I was always being monitored. Grounding fact: the concept of psychological trophy-taking exists in folklore across many cultures, where malevolent spirits or entities seek not just physical destruction, but the erasure of identity and memory, using the victim as a tool of communication or intimidation for survivors. Sarah Chun was precisely this, a living testament to the entity's capacity for conceptual theft. The question of a successor became an obsession. I knew Isaac had nearly died before finding me, and the resulting chaos had been devastating. I spent my days looking at the young people on the reservation, bright, modern, connected to the internet and the outside world, and realized how impossible it was. They lacked the foundation of fear, the inherited memory that allowed one to cross the threshold of belief. I tried training a few promising candidates in the history of the first law and the land's traditional stories, hoping to introduce the second law gently. One boy, clever and earnest, just asked, "If they are so powerful, Elias, Why do they let us live here at all? I couldn't answer that perfectly, but Isaac's words echoed. They don't want to kill us. They want to be acknowledged. Our attention is their currency. I feared that my death, whenever it came, would break the chain and drown the valley. I often dreamt of the stone crown, but not of the ritual. I dreamed of the entities moving past the boundary, flowing down the slopes like thick, cold oil, silent and vast, erasing everything in their path. Speculative concept. I started documenting everything, not in police reports, but in coded notes hidden deep within my grandfather's old texts, preserving the knowledge for a distant future keeper. I detailed the ritual steps, the precise locations of the energy nodes, and the language of the contract. This documentation, I reasoned, was my last defense against the ultimate horror, the complete collapse of the boundary due to forgetting. It was my backup plan for mortality, hoping that if I died unexpectedly, someone, someday, might stumble upon the truth and take up the burden. One evening, 6 weeks after Sarah's return, I was on solo patrol, driving the perimeter road near Naomi's old house. It was raining, and the static in my head was high. I knew one of the entities was close, inspecting the edge of the boundary. I saw Naomi walking. She was outside her family's house, walking slowly toward the tree line, wearing only a thin nightgown despite the cold. She moved with that same vacant, measured gait Sarah Chun possessed. I stopped the car, rushing toward her. Naomi, where are you going? She didn't stop, didn't look at me. Her eyes were fixed on the deep forest. I just remembered, she whispered, her voice almost joyful, unnervingly lucid for the first time in months. I remembered the smell, ozone and rain, and they told me the contract is getting old, Elias. They said the new keeper is promising, but his fear is too structured. They want a new kind of sacrifice. Terror seized me, visceral, crushing, far worse than anything the cattle or Megan Cole had felt. The entity was here, using Naomi as a mouthpiece, demanding renegotiation. Was I failing? Was the attention I offered no longer enough? I seized her arm, pulling her back toward the house. No, Naomi, you stay here. I made the promise. She struggled, weakly, her eyes wide and suddenly recognizing me, flooding with profound pity. You will not last, Elias. They are patient. They will wait until you find a successor, and then they will take both of you, and the boundary will fall forever. She wasn't trying to escape. She was warning me. The contract was not between the entity and the community. It was between the entity and the lineage. They wanted the assurance of continuity, and they were willing to break their promise about her mental stability to send me a tactical message. I managed to get her inside and secure the door. I drove away quickly, the obsidian talisman hot in my hand, the knowledge settling over me like a shroud. I had saved the valley, but I had guaranteed my own isolated servitude and a life defined by the search for someone to condemn to the same eternal watch. Reflective thought. True horror isn't the sudden attack, but the long, cold realization that you succeeded in delaying the catastrophe, only to become the catastrophe's next focus. I had become the boundary, a living wall, and the constant awareness of the hungry void on the other side was my only reward. I was alone, forever bound to a mountain that remembered everything I had sworn to forget. The entities released Sarah Chun, not as a mercy, but as a reminder of their eternal presence. I am still the keeper, I am still searching. The mountain watches, silent and patient, and the long night of the Sentinel Valley, secured by a fragile, impossible contract, continues to stretch out into the darkness. The light of the screen is fading now, the shadows in your room softening as the hour deepens toward the inevitable gray wash of morning. You can breathe now. The sound of the mountain recedes, carried away on the static of a dead radio frequency, leaving behind only the sound of your own pulse slowing back to normal rhythm. I lean back, the chair groaning softly in the sudden, expansive silence. The narrative ends, but the watch does not. Elias Redcrow is still out there, driving the perimeter roads of the Sentinel Valley, forever bound to a contract signed in obsidian and the cold air of the high peaks. His servitude ensures the rest of us can sleep soundly, disconnected from the deep architecture of dread. He succeeded in securing a fragile peace, a tolerance from the ancient ones, but he failed in one crucial area, escaping the consequences of responsibility. He carries the knowledge now, the terrible awareness that the entities are not gone, merely disciplined. He walks among a people who have forgotten the price of their quiet lives, seeking a replacement for a job